Chapter 6. The summons for the audience with Queen Eruda came soon after they had finished their drinks and Anmar had replaced their used beakers on the table. They were called by a competent-looking young woman who entered the anteroom from a door at the side. She marked off their names with a business-like air on the written schedule she carried, then opened the large carved double doors into the audience chamber. She preceded them a short way into the large audience room and announced in a clear voice, "Your Highness, Lound Regiment Captain Leonard Denarian, and Mistress Anmar Lenec and her brother, Mr. Dane Lenec." And as Zand strode confidently forward to stand full square next to Leonard, she added with the merest hint of a fluster in her voice, "And Captain Denarian's Lound, Your Highness. He seems disinclined to remain in the antechamber, if that is in order?" At the Queen's smiling nod, she gestured for them to move forward before stepping back into the antechamber and closing the big doors behind her. As they hesitantly walked into the spacious room, they were impressed by both the luxury and the functionality of the furnishings. The room was well lit by big banks of ceiling-high windows on two sides. As they crossed the deep-pile wine-red carpet, the Queen rose from her seat behind a large desk, moved a few steps towards them, and then stood waiting quietly for them to reach her. She was a tall, youthful-looking and strikingly elegant woman, with only the merest touches of grey in her abundant head of dark upswept hair. She was dressed in a long and beautiful flowing robe, in muted shades of rose, velvety maroon, and old gold. Leonard thought that she seemed not to have aged at all since he had briefly met her almost 10 years before. As they approached, her gaze moved calmly from one to the other, lingering on Leonard with a brief yet cordial nod of recognition, and then came to rest on the Lound. Leonard picked up the faintest of mental whispers. "Zand," as the Lound introduced himself in a humble tone, and was rewarded with a nod and the merest hint of a quizzical smile and briefly lifted eyebrow by the Queen. When the party reached her and Leonard started going down on one knee, she put out her hand and stopped him. "No need for that, Captain Denarian. I do not stand on too much ceremony here. You are all welcome in my home." Her voice was low and serene and very calming. She shook each of them by the hand and then gestured towards a round table and a number of comfortable-looking chairs grouped around it. "Let us seat ourselves over there," she said. "It will be more informal and comfortable." As they moved towards the chairs, she briefly laid a feather-light touch on the top of Zand's head. "And do relieve this poor creature of his lead and this unsightly muzzle contraption. I am sure he would not hurt the smallest little fledgling eave-sparrow." Zand gave the Queen a long veiled look as Leonard removed the offending items. Then the big animal lay down quietly on the floor between the chairs taken by the Queen and Leonard, in his habitual pose of head on paws. Anmar and Dane seated themselves side by side across from them. Again the Queen looked at each of them in turn in unhurried fashion. "I sense that you are all tired and have had a hard journey, but before you start telling me why you are here, will you partake of some luncheon with me?" As they all indicated grateful acceptance, the Queen briefly rested a finger on a button recessed into the top of the table. Almost immediately, a door set in the wall opposite, between two towering and heavily laden bookcases, opened. A houseman, neatly attired in what they were coming to recognize as the household livery, appeared and crossed the room towards them. "You rang, Your Highness?" he said courteously. "Yes, thank you, Petrus. Will you please serve luncheon here for myself and our guests, and some of the light Rhenish we received from Governor Demito last week?" As the houseman nodded, "Of course, Your Highness," and started to turn away, Queen Eruda stopped him with a gesture. "Just a moment, Petrus. Captain, what should we offer your lion hound? Will a well-roasted haunch of lowland antelope suffice for him, do you think?" As Leonard accepted promptly on Zand's behalf, and the Lound lifted a suddenly alert head, the Queen lowered a fleeting hand to the animal's head again. "And a large bowl of water, perhaps?" As Leonard nodded, he was aware of and appreciated the fact that the Queen was observing the polite Lound and handler convention of not communicating directly with the Lound whilst his handler was present. When the door had closed behind the houseman again, Queen Eruda leaned back in her chair and spoke to the company as a whole. "Now, tell me why you are here. Captain, you start, please." Leonard looked from the Queen to Anmar, to Dane, and then back at the Queen. Then he unconsciously reached down and gripped a handful of Zand's mane and took a deep breath. He started their story by first telling the Queen that their respective missions were at the behest of King Dinar and Anmar and Dane's uncle, Governor Delon of Lanatek. He gave a brief and concise account of their journey, first his and Zand's through the Dimnor Forest, the Wilder Lands, and the North Bagnor Mountains, and then their joint journey in company with Anmar and Dane from Rickel over the plateaus. As he spoke, he was aware of a focusing of the Queen's attention in ever-growing intensity, especially as he described their narrow escape with the burnt-down hut on the Upper Plains plateau. From time to time, he called on either Anmar or Dane to confirm or elucidate, or expand a point, though they all attempted to keep their accounts as short and precise as possible. Halfway through their tale, luncheon was served, which temporarily halted their narrative. As they enjoyed the well-prepared food, meticulously served in the unobtrusive way of excellently trained attendants, the conversation became more general and ranged from everyday topics like daily life in Gordofane, horse riding, the weather, life on a marrowroot farm, even skincare, as Anmar mentioned her aunt's soothing herbal remedy for when a low-pressure system over the marrowroot lands brought the desiccating erg winds blowing in from the hot sands of the Etabrian desert. The Queen's easy courtesy made them all feel remarkably relaxed in her august company. Immediately after the meal had been cleared away, however, they returned to the much more serious matters that had prompted their mission to Gordofane. At the Queen's request, Lhounds resumed their narrative by telling the Queen the main reason for their journey, namely to acquaint her on the King's behest with the rumours and speculations doing the rounds. He called on Anmar to report on the disappearances of the juvenile Lhounds from the Lhound breeding centres in the province of Lanatek. They jointly expanded on the stories that Lhounds were being used to commit atrocities under the control of a very powerful sender, and that these Lhounds were rumoured to be capable of not just stopping their own hearts, but possibly those of other Lhounds as well. With obvious reluctance, Anmar referred to the terrifying possibility that was also being mooted, that these Lhounds could do this to humans as well. Almost apologetically, Lhounds mentioned the no doubt completely unfounded tale of Lhounds having been seen in the snowbound and inhospitable far southern vastnesses. Finally, and with some hesitation, Lhounds told the Queen about the sender that they had encountered in the inn at Rickle, and how he had tried to probe their minds. Even more hesitantly, he mentioned their suspicions that this sender might be the very man who had travelled ahead of them at such haste across the plateaus, and was as such more than likely responsible for burning down the hut on the Upper Plains plateau. Throughout their recital, the Queen followed every word with complete and utterly focused attention, though her only response was the occasional nod of encouragement and brief comments like, "I see, and do continue, please." During the whole of their account to Queen Eruda, Zand had been lying quietly on the floor, seemingly asleep, though Lhounds sensed him as a continuous low-level presence in his mind, so knew that the Lhound was following everything that was being said. He sensed an abrupt escalation of Zand's presence in his mind when the Queen, after the silence that had ensued when their account drew to a close, said, "I would now, with your permission, of course, like to scan your minds, so that I can get all your sense and emotional impressions out these matters as well. It is very important for me to do this, to make sure that I am fully informed about everything that you know, or suspect, and have experienced. I will, of course, observe habitual telepath courtesy and not infringe on personal areas in your minds. But I first have to shield the room." She got up and moved across to her desk, where she lifted a small section in the top of it. She depressed several small levers before closing the little hinged flap again. As she walked back to her seat, heavily opaque screens slid out from recesses next to the windows and moved slowly across to cover them. Two smaller ones slid in place in front of the doors. At the same time, a big bank of lights bloomed into soft light above the Queen's desk. They all rose courteously while the Queen seated herself again and leaned back in her chair in a relaxed posture. "Now, may I scan your minds, please?" she asked. They all nodded and similarly leaned back in their chairs, though they were all rather tense at the prospect of the Queen's mental scrutiny. At his side, Lhounds was vaguely conscious that Zand had risen to his feet. Shortly, Lhounds became conscious of the Queen's mind as a gentle but very potent presence that swept into his mind like an irresistible force. Across the table from him, he heard Anmar actually give a little gasp as the Queen's mind impacted on hers. Dane sat almost literally transfixed as the Queen's powerful mind, assessing and evaluating and interpreting, probed into theirs with courteous but obviously consummate ease. But then, quite suddenly, the Queen's mind was gone from Lhounds. In its place was simply a smooth, dense layer of protective and curiously restful blankness that covered his mind in complete impenetrability. Queen Eruda leant forward abruptly and looked at each of the humans with searing intensity. Then her glance moved to Zand. "You," she said in a shocked, disbelieving whisper. "You? No," she said more loudly. She turned more fully towards the Lhound, whose eyes were now fixed on hers in glittering, unblinking focus. "You are shielding them? You are locking me out of all three of their minds?" For a few seemingly interminable seconds, the huge animal and the queen stared into each other's eyes, in what seemed a moment of immutable stasis. Then Zan's mind deliberately retreated. The queen's mind was suddenly back in the mind space of all three humans. However, there was another presence there as well. The Lhounds' adamantine mind was also there, stronger and more dominant than Leonard had ever experienced it. But then it softened and gentled and warmed as it spread an aura of reassurance so powerful that the four humans, by this time all rigidly tensed forward in their chairs, involuntarily leaned back and relaxed. After a few stunned moments, during which the four humans exchanged some still baffled glances and tried to compose themselves, Queen Eruda gave Zand another long, assessing stare, and then looked at Leonard. She took a deep breath and ran graceful fingers across her forehead and down the side of her face. "So are you trying to tell me, or not tell me, that this creature of yours is not only a sender, but a shielder as well?" Leonard nodded in flustered apology. "Yes, Your Highness, I am afraid so, and I was assuredly going to tell you, but the wicked beast preempted me. I do not know what possessed him to do that. I feel tempted not to feed him for a week to punish him." He allowed his utter mortification to clearly colour the strong mental reprimand he sent to Zand. But then everybody, including the Queen, burst into spontaneous laughter, as the Lound sent a deliberately foolish image of a chastened Lound puppy, contritely covering his eyes with fat furry paws, then peeking hopefully through them at a feeding bowl that remained stubbornly empty. "Poor Zand will be so thin after a week." Their joint laughter managed to diffuse the situation wonderfully. When they were all calm again, the Queen, still smiling, turned to Leonard. "It is really important that I know how strong Zand's mind is. May I talk to him? That is, if he will let me." There was just the merest touch of acerbity in the final phrase of the Queen's courteous request. "Of course, Your Highness," Leonard replied. He turned to the Lound, whose eyes were already fixed on the Queen. "Zand?" he mind queried gently. For a moment he had his usual mental connection with the Lionhound. Then he felt Zand's mind slipping away from his. And for the first time in his life, Leonard was able to empathize with Ords and the unease the communication between Lounds and minds inspired in them. He could sense that there was intense mind traffic between Zand and Queen Eruda, but could not read it at all. After a few minutes of this, he felt that he was starting to develop a fierce headache and experience a growing sense of unease. Across from him, Anmar pressed both hands to her temples, and Dane's forehead was furrowed in distress as well. Anmar's movement caught the Queen's attention. Abruptly the mind static ceased, and with it the stressful fallout on the three minds. Wordlessly, the Queen held out her hand to Zand, who had remained standing next to Leonard throughout his telepathic communication with the Queen. The Lound moved across to her, and then, incredibly, rested his broad muzzle on her shoulder. Even more startling, the Queen's arms came up, and she held the tawny bulk of the massive beast for a long moment. Then she took a very deep breath and leant back in her chair. "Well," she said, on a long, sighing exhalation. Her face bore a slight, wondering smile. Zand turned back to Leonard, briefly rubbed his head against the man's shoulder, and then lay down on the floor next to him. Complete silence reigned in the room for fully a minute before Queen Eruda sat forward in her chair. "I think we should adjourn for now. I, for one, am very tired, and I certainly have a great deal to consider and weigh up. I think I must also have a meeting with my 3 closest advisers about all this. Let us reconvene here at the 10th hour tomorrow. In the interim, I would like all of you to have a good rest, but also to give some concentrated thought to all that has happened, and all the rumors, no matter how outrageous, that you have passed on to me. Let your minds range as widely and speculatively as you like. Inspiration often comes in the most unlikely fashion when one does that. I would also request that you do not talk to anybody else about the matters that we have discussed here today. Would that be in order?" As they all nodded, the Queen continued. "May I offer you accommodation in the palace, or have you made other arrangements?" When they all accepted the Queen's offer with evident relief, she rose from her seat. She moved across to her desk, where she deactivated the window and door shields, which slid back into their respective recesses. She returned to the table and pressed the button in the tabletop. When the houseman made his prompt appearance, she requested that an apartment be prepared for the travellers. "Captain Denarian, do you want Zand to stay with you, or do you think he would prefer to spend some time with the other Lounds in the Lound barracks?" An interrogatively lifted eyebrow at Zand elicited the response that he would prefer the Lound barracks for a change, and then a teasingly faded-out mind send of, "at least for the next week." The Queen gave a gentle laugh and requested that Petrus take the Lound to the barracks, and on his way to give instructions about preparing an apartment for the 3 humans. "Send word when the apartment is ready, will you, Petros?" she requested just before the houseman and the Lound left the audience chamber. Leonard felt a curious wrench as he watched the Lound following the houseman, but then he had to smile at Zan's exaggerated image of docile placidness as he padded dutifully after the houseman. Just before the doors closed, Zan's usual leave-taking warmed his mind, and Leonard was able to relax a little. When the door had closed behind them, the Queen looked at Leonard and gave a gentle, wondering shake of the head. "That is a most unusual animal you have there, Captain. I have never encountered a Lound mind of such power and complexity, and believe me, I have dealt with some very strong and sophisticated lion-hounds before." As Leonard nodded affirmatively, she continued, "And I cannot rid myself of the suspicion that he still only allowed me to see just what he wanted me to see when we mind spoke." In the thoughtful silence that briefly ensued, Anmar spoke quietly. "Your Highness, Zan saved our lives up on that plateau. For the last hour of that nightmare journey, he carried us all, 3 humans and 4 horses, and all of us in an almost fatally weakened and debilitated state, himself included. I would not have believed it possible." After a moment she went on, "And in that inn in Rickel, Your Highness, Zan blocked off that sender's access to Leonard and Dane so completely that I don't think the sender even realized that they were telepaths, though in the light of what happened later, and our suspicions that he might have listened in to our conversation in Leonard's room the night before, I am quite possibly wrong. But I am fairly convinced that he thought I was Zan's handler, because I shoved him out rather rudely when he tried to probe my mind. And yet Zan did the shielding so subtly and yet so completely that neither Leonard nor Dane even knew that the sender was trying to scan them." Anmar gave a frustrated sigh, and then continued very emphatically, "And that sender was very strong, Your Highness. Really very, very strong. I still do not understand how Zan did it." During Anmar's words, Leonard was sitting with an ever-growing look of concern and frowning bafflement on his face. When Anmar fell silent, he started speaking musingly, obviously tentatively and uneasily feeling his way. "I have known Zan for 12 years now, since I was a very young man, still a boy, really. I have literally seen him grown up, and I have grown up with him. We have just simply been part of each other's lives for what seems forever. And yet I have realized for some time that I actually have no idea where or what his limits are. I have in essence come to regard him as virtually indestructible. When he collapsed in that hut up there, I truly received the biggest shock I have ever had in my life. The thought of him dying is more than I can bear to even think of. And yet it would seem I barely know the first thing about him." Leonard's unease, indeed distress, was clearly evident. The Queen leaned forward in her chair and laid a strong, well-shaped hand over his, in a moment's firm, warm, and reassuring pressure. "Captain Denarian, let me tell you something without betraying any confidences acquired during my and Zan's mutual mind scan. The bond that he feels with you is just as strong, possibly even stronger, than the one you feel with him. You are quite simply the lodestone of his life. I have seen strong bonds between handlers and their Lounds before. Indeed, this very element comprises the main strength of our Lound regiment and its various divisions, but I have never yet encountered a bond between a handler and his Lound as complete as the one you and Zan share. Have no moment's doubt on that account. And in all the essentials you do know everything important about him, just as he does about you. There is not even the merest shadow of a reason for the trust between you and Zan to be compromised to the slightest extent." Leonard had been following every word of the Queen's with avid attention. As she talked, it became evident that her words were easing his troubled spirit. Indeed, by the time she finished, his face had cleared completely, and he sat back in his chair with a gusty sigh of palpable and clearly heartfelt relief. Another long silence ensued, during which they were all busy with their own thoughts. After some time, the Queen said pensively, and in such a low and ruminating tone of voice, it was as if she was speaking to herself as much as to them, "We have discovered some significant strength today. Possibly, after all, there is significant hope." Almost immediately after this enigmatic utterance, the big double doors opened after a firm knock, and the young woman who had shown them into the audience chamber earlier stood on the threshold. "Your Highness, the visitors' quarters are ready," she reported in her clear voice. Queen Neruda stood up, and as she gestured towards the doorway, Leonard, Anmar, and Dane followed suit. Walking with him to the door, the Queen said, "Thank you, Mela. Please show our guests the way and make sure that they have everything they need and are fully informed about meal times and where the refectory and other facilities are." As the big double doors closed behind them, the Queen's mind gently wafted across theirs in a brief but cordial leave-taking. Until tomorrow, rest well and be at ease. They all felt warmed and comforted by it. As they followed Mela at the brisk pace she set, they became newly aware of the size of the palace. On their way she pointed out the refectory, the general withdrawing room where people could congregate and take their ease before and after meal times, 2 reading rooms, the administrative offices, the infirmary, laundry rooms, training and lecture rooms, and even a large hall that contained 2 heated indoor bathing pools. One is really steaming hot, and the other one is nice to cool off in, she said smilingly. As they passed a big window at the top of a wide staircase, Mela paused and pointed across at a large low building that formed 2 sides of a spacious paved area below them, now already in shadow. Seeing this, they realized that they had spent virtually the entire afternoon with Queen Eruda. The building you see directly across from us there is the Lound Barracks, Mela said, and the stables are off to the left there, at a right angle to them, as you can see. You just follow the passage on the ground floor to the right till you get to the big double doors at the end. That will take you onto the exercise courtyard below. It is normally crawling with hounds, but at this time of the day they are all inside, being given their main meal of the day. None of them ever miss that. Her voice held the tolerant tone of the true Lound telepath. Oh, and just to the far of the stables, there is an arched doorway that will take you to a large park developed in the palace grounds on the other side of the hill. There are good riding paths there if you want to give your horses some exercise, or just relax and let your Lounds run around a bit. Shortly after this, they reached the quarters allocated to them. Mela showed them into a seating area furnished with comfortable chairs, reading globes, and a small eating counter with stools. 4 doors led off the central room. She pointed at the first one on the right. Your belongings have been put in this sleeping room, Captain Denarian, and your things are in the first one on the left here, Mistress Lanatic, and yours are in the next room next to your sister's, Mr. Lanatic. She handed them 2 keys each. The bigger one unlocks the main door to the apartment, and the smaller ones the sleeping rooms. A slightly embarrassed frown creased her smooth brow for a moment. We never used to bother much with keys, but recently we have had trouble with unauthorized, shall we say, incursions into private areas, so Queen Eruda decreed that all the private apartments and rooms should be issued with keys, so please keep your rooms locked when you are not here. Then she led them across to a services board against the wall, just to the right of the main door. This is really self-evident, as all the call buttons are clearly marked, but just let me explain briefly in any case. This bell communicates with the kitchens. You just hold down the button for a few seconds, and then speak into this mouthpiece here if you require anything between meals, though everybody is requested to have their main meals in the dining hall, as it makes things easier for the household staff. This one will connect you to housekeeping if you need extra coverlets or pillows, or if you want laundry collected. This one will connect you to the scriptorium if you need a scribe to help you with anything, or want to send messages by fast courier. This one will connect you with the Queen's office. One of her scribes or assistant scribes will answer, and you can request an audience. And this last one will connect you with the palace protection staff. If anything seems amiss, please report it immediately. Again, we hardly ever had any problems, but recently there have been some unfortunate incidents. So please do not hesitate to bring anything that seems even vaguely disquieting or odd to the attention of the protection services. Our palace commander is Colonel Kendar, so ask that anything be passed on to him or one of his aides immediately. Mela stepped back from the board and looked at each of them in turn. Is there anything else you want to know? Any questions? When they all shook their heads, she smiled and turned towards the door. Ah, yes, there is something else. A bell always rings for meal times, but we are quite flexible, within reason, of course. And next to each of your beds there is a booklet that gives meal times, names of the senior staff members, and so on, as well as a bit of the palace protocol and some history. I suggest you look through it. She gave them a friendly smile and left, closing the door behind her. For a few moments they stood looking at each other, then plopped down like one person into the comfortable chairs. All at once they felt utterly spent, too tired even to talk. After a while Anmar got up reluctantly to inspect her sleeping room. Leonard and Dane followed suit. They all found that their somewhat meagre belongings had been unpacked and distributed in the compact but well-designed rooms. Toilet items on the small dressing tables, night clothes neatly laid out on the comfortable-looking beds, clothes cleaned, pressed, and neatly hung up and stowed away in the dressing alcove, which was also equipped with ablution facilities behind a sliding partition. When they reassembled in the seating area, Leonard said longingly, I would not mind a relaxing session in a nice hot pool, but I do not have anything to bathe in, do you? Both Anmar and Dane shook their heads. Then Anmar's face lit up. She went to the services board against the wall and pressed the housekeeping bell. When a courteous voice answered, she explained their predicament, and received the welcome news that new bathing garments, as well as cotton drying off cloths, could be purchased from the attendant in the bathing hall. They left their apartment with alacrity. An hour and a half later, when the bell rang for the final meal of the day, they were dressed and waiting. Their bathe had refreshed and relaxed them, and at the same time they felt invigorated by it. As they obeyed the summons of the bell, calling them to the eventide meal, and walked to the refectory, they also realized that they were very hungry. They thoroughly enjoyed the food on offer in the crowded dining hall, as well as the friendly and convivial conversation with the other people seated at the table they were shown to. By the end of the meal, however, they declined all offers to participate in any post-eventide activities. They were more than ready to retire and seek their beds for an early night's sleep.